All right, so, we've been getting a lot of questions from you listeners about the CFPB.
The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau.
Yeah, exactly. And it seems like there's some serious drama going on over there.
Oh, absolutely. And it's the kind of drama that could end up hitting you right in the wallet.
Right, because we're talking about potential changes to rules on things like credit cards and loans.
Even digital payments.
Yeah, so basically all this stuff that we use every day.
It all stems from a shakeup at the very top of the CFPB.
Okay, so just to bring everyone up to speed.
Yeah.
The CFPB was created after the 2008 financial crisis.
Right, to protect consumers from the kind of predatory practices that actually contributed to that crisis.
But we're talking about things like predatory loans and hidden fees.
Aggressive debt collection tactics, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, it was designed to be a watchdog, an advocate for everyday folks.
Making sure they're not getting taken advantage of by big financial institutions.
And they've had some pretty significant wins, especially under their previous director, Rohit Chopra.
Appointed by President Biden.
Right, and he was known for being pretty tough on the industry.
He really went after things like excessive overdraft fees and credit card late fees, the kind that make your stomach drop when you see them on your statement.
Oh, yeah, those are the worst.
Exactly.
But I guess that made him a target.
Oh, for sure. The financial industry was not a fan of Chopra's aggressive approach.
So then what happened?
Well, President Trump fired him and appointed Scott Bessent as acting director.
And now this is where it gets really interesting, because Bessent is also
the Treasury Secretary.
Yeah, which is not exactly a typical situation.
Yeah, very unusual. And it definitely raised some eyebrows because, Bessent comes from a hedge fund background.
So some people see this as a sign that
that the CFPB might be shifting toward a more hands-off approach.
More business-friendly, maybe?
Potentially. I mean, when Bessent took over, he said, and I quote,
Okay.
I look forward to working with the CFPB to advance President Trump's agenda to lower costs for the American people and accelerate economic growth.
So what do you make of that statement?
Well, it's a bit open to interpretation, but it does suggest a lighter touch when it comes to regulation.
Okay, so we've got Chopra, the consumer champion who's been ousted, and now we've got Bessent, the new guy with a pro-business background.
Setting the stage for a real showdown.
A battle royale. But they're not the only players in this game, right?
Absolutely not. You've got powerful interest groups on both sides of this issue.
Like who?
Well, on the one hand, you have groups like the Consumer Bankers Association. They represent the big banks, and they've been very critical of the CFPB under Chopra.
So I'm guessing they're pretty happy about this change in leadership.
You could say that they've been praising Bessent and his commitment to what they call a more balanced approach.
I see. And then on the other side, we have
consumer advocates, folks like Senator Elizabeth Warren. She was instrumental in creating the CFPB, and she's been a fierce critic of efforts to weaken it.
Right, and she's been pretty vocal about this whole situation.
Very much so. She sees this as a direct attack on consumers and a dangerous move that could leave people vulnerable to the same kind of abuses that led to the 2008 crisis.
And it's not just advocacy groups. We also have key members of Congress who've been pushing for changes at the CFPB.
Right, people like Representative French Hill and Senator Tim Scott.
Both Republicans.
Exactly. They've argued that the CFPB has overstepped its authority and needs to be reined in.
They've even talked about putting it under the congressional appropriations process,
which would give Congress much more control over the CFPB's budget and operations.
So it sounds like we have a real battle brewing here.
A real power struggle with a lot at stake.
Okay, so we've met the players now. What are they actually fighting over?
What are the specific rules and regulations that are now in jeopardy? Well, that's what we'll get into next. It's easy to get bogged down in all the political stuff, but at the end of the day, this is about your money.
Right, like how could this actually affect me?
Well, let's take those overdraft fees, for example.
Okay.
Remember those rules Chopra put in place to limit those fees?
Ugh, yeah, the ones that the banks hate.
Right. Well, if those rules are reversed or weakened, it could mean that
I end up paying more.
Exactly. Those fees could go up and banks could have more leeway to charge them.
So even a small overdraft could end up costing me a lot more.
And it's not just about the amount, it's also about how those fees are applied.
Like, what do you mean?
Well, under the current rules, banks have to be more transparent about their overdraft policies and give consumers more notice before hitting them with fees.
Which makes sense. You shouldn't be surprised by a huge fee.
Right. But if those rules are rolled back, banks could be a lot less transparent and consumers could be more vulnerable to surprise charges.
So it's not just about the money, it's about fairness and transparency.
Absolutely. And, these kinds of fees, they often hit the people who can least afford them.
Right. People who are already struggling to make ends meet.
Exactly.
Okay. And what about those credit card late fees?
Those could be affected, too.
Like how?
Well, the CFPB under Chopra was pushing for rules that would limit the amount of those fees and require banks to be more upfront about how they calculate them.
So again, more transparency, more consumer protection.
Right, but if those rules are reversed, those late fees could creep back up and banks could have more freedom to charge whatever they want.
It's like taking away a safety net.
In a way, yeah, it's about making sure that the system isn't rigged against consumers.
Okay, so we talked about overdraft fees and credit card late fees. What about open banking?
Ah, yes, open banking. This is a big one.
I'm still trying to wrap my head around it.
Well, it's basically about giving you more control over your own financial data. Right now, that data is often siloed within banks and other financial institutions.
And they don't always make it easy to access.
Exactly. But with open banking, you would have the right to easily and securely share your data with third-party providers.
Like what kind of providers?
Well, think about apps that help you budget better, or services that compare loan rates from different lenders.
So I could use my own data to find better deals.
Exactly. It's about empowering consumers and fostering more competition in the financial marketplace.
But why is this such a controversial issue?
Well, the banking industry has some concerns about open banking.
Like what?
They worry about data security and privacy, and they also fear that it could disrupt their existing business models.
Because it would make it easier for people to switch banks.
And shop around for better deals, exactly.
So they're basically trying to protect their turf.
In a way, yeah. But for consumers, open banking has the potential to be a game changer.
Okay, I'm starting to see the appeal.
It's about convenience, transparency, and control.
But will it actually happen in the U.S.?
That's a big question mark, and a lot depends on what happens at the CFPB.
Okay, so open banking is one to watch, for sure. And then there's the whole issue of non-banks.
Ah, yes, the rise of the fintech companies.
You know, all those apps and platforms we use to manage our money?
Right, the ones that aren't traditional banks but are increasingly involved in financial services.
Exactly. Like, why should I care about whether they're regulated or not?
Because they're handling your money?
Yeah.
And because they're not always subject to the same rules and oversight as traditional banks.
So there's more potential for things to go wrong.
Potentially, yes. There have been cases where these platforms have been hacked or have engaged in risky lending practices.
So Chopra was trying to bring them under the CFPB's umbrella.
Exactly. He argued that consumers deserve the same level of protection regardless of whether they're dealing with a bank or a fintech company.
Which makes sense to me.
But again, it's an area where we might see some backpedaling under the new leadership.
So more uncertainty for consumers.
It seems that way.
Okay, so we've got overdraft fees, credit card late fees, open banking, non-bank regulation, all these things potentially on the line.
And we can't forget about medical debt.
Right. What's happening with those rules that Chopra was working on?
The ones that would limit the impact of medical debt on people's credit reports.
Yeah, those seem like a big deal.
They were a major priority for Chopra. He saw medical debt as a huge burden on consumers.
And he wanted to make it harder for that debt to damage people's credit scores.
Exactly. But the credit reporting industry has been pushing back hard against those rules.
So are they likely to survive?
It's hard to say. Bessent hasn't really tipped his hand on this issue yet.
So more uncertainty.
It seems to be the theme of the day.
So where does all of this leave us? What does it mean for the average person trying to navigate this increasingly complex financial world?
Well, that's a question we'll explore further in just a moment.
Okay, so we've been talking about all these specific regulations that could be affected by what's happening to the CFPB, but what does this all mean, like in the grand scheme of things?
Well, I think it really highlights this tension that always exists between, the push for deregulation.
Like less government intervention.
Exactly. And the need for strong consumer protections, especially in an industry as complex and powerful as finance.
It's kind of like a constant tug of war, isn't it?
It is.
And right now, it seems like the deregulation side is gaining ground, at least in this particular arena.
Yeah. And it's hard not to think about the subprime mortgage crisis when you see this kind of shift happening.
Oh, totally. That was a pretty stark reminder of what can happen when you loosen regulations too much.
Exactly. You end up with these risky lending practices, and ultimately it's the consumers who pay the price.
And it feels like we're kind of headed down that same path again.
Well, it's definitely something to be aware of, and it underscores the importance of being an informed consumer.
Okay, so what can our listeners do to protect themselves in this kind of environment where the rules seem to be constantly changing?
Well, first and foremost, stay informed.
Like how?
Read articles from reputable sources, follow organizations that advocate for consumer rights.
So basically do your homework.
Exactly. The more you know about what's happening, the better equipped you'll be to make smart decisions.
Knowledge is power.
It really is, especially when it comes to your finances.
Okay, so stay informed, but what about taking action? Can we actually do anything to influence this?
Absolutely, make your voice heard. Contact your elected officials, tell them that consumer protection matters.
Right. Let them know that we're paying attention.
Exactly, and support organizations that are fighting for your rights.
So there's power in numbers.
There is.
And what about on a more personal level, like what can I do in my own life to protect myself?
Well, be vigilant when you're managing your finances. Read the fine print on any agreements before you sign them.
Don't just skim over it.
Right. Take the time to understand what you're agreeing to, and don't be afraid to ask questions if something doesn't make sense.
It's about being your own advocate.
Exactly, and shop around for the best deals on financial products. Don't just go with the first offer you get.
And if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
That's a good rule of thumb.
So basically, be proactive, don't be passive.
Exactly. Take control of your financial destiny.
Well, this has been a really eye-opening deep dive into the CFPB. We've covered a lot of ground.
We have from the power struggles at the top to the potential impact on your everyday life.
And, it's a little unsettling to think that all these protections that were being put in place could be rolled back.
It is, but I think the key takeaway here is awareness.
Right, knowing what's happening and what's at stake.
Exactly, and then using that knowledge to make informed decisions and to advocate for yourself.
And to make your voice heard.
Exactly, because ultimately this is about your money and your financial well-being.
Well said. So to all our listeners out there, stay informed, stay engaged, and keep fighting the good fight.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the CFPB shakeup.